The beginning of this day was not entirely ordinary because it was the day when our main character left the army. The main character was in the bathroom and getting ready to go to his new university. He was an absolute handsome man, and after the army he became even more confident in himself, so he knew that he could easily pick up girls. But he first decided to go to the festival so that it would be easier for him to meet everyone and get closer. And also there he could find a girl. Before he went to the army, he was a very popular young man who often met girls, and now he was wondering what happened to them. He was walking calmly down the street when suddenly he heard screams behind him and immediately turned around to make sure everything was okay. He instantly reacted to this and ran towards the screams, where he saw two adult men trying to get to the bottom of an innocent girl. Without thinking about the consequences, he immediately stood up for the girl, acting like a man. A moment passed as two robbers were lying on the ground, and he had already become a hero in the eyes of this girl. This girl immediately thanked him specifically, leaving him her contacts and her name, and that's how they met each other. At this moment, our main character was very happy, because he realized that guys like him are still attractive to girls. He, of course, continued to think so, but after graduating from university, his life went completely in the wrong direction and everything changed a lot. He got a job in a huge and successful company that was engaged in tailoring, but there was one small nuance. In this company, there were almost all girls, that's why they ruled there. Despite this, they were undeniably beautiful. They were certainly beautiful, but in such an atmosphere, there was no quiet place for our hero to breathe normally. He was calmly working at his computer when suddenly one girl from his company decided to get to the bottom of him, pretending that he was watching her. At this moment, our hero was confused and scared because this situation would become dangerous for his work. But at that moment, the manager entered the work office, who was very kind, and decided to stand up for Deputy Kim. Deputy Kim is very angry with G1rl, who began to slander him. Despite the fact that she was younger than him, she treated him very rudely. His only salvation at that moment was his leader, who decided to stand up for him and help him in this conflict. She, of course, stood up for him, but decided to warn him not to do that again because now was a very dangerous time, when even for a glance he could be imprisoned. Because they started warning him, he was a little upset, but he had to agree with everything that the leader told him because she cared about him. It was a special day for Kim, because on that day a new employee was supposed to come to their office. He always dreams about it, to make friends with him. He hoped that it would be a guy who was a new employee, but his hope was dashed when a young girl who had only recently completed her studies entered the office. To his surprise, it turned out that they graduated from the same university, so her name seemed very familiar to him, which made him wary. It so happened that they were trained in the same place, so Kim's deputy was asked to handle her training on the job. He certainly couldn't refuse it. Minjin was told to sit next to Kim so that she could observe his work and could study without distracting Kim himself. Today was not an easy day for Manager Kim, because today he had to submit a report, and at the same time train a new employee. At the same time, the girl who was breathing unevenly towards Kim decided to compliment the manager on her makeup so that she would cool down. Manager Kim was unhappy, because he thought that Deputy Choi was constantly messing around and she didn't notice it at all. He was very tired, but suddenly he turned his gaze to the new girl, who had already sat down next to her and was ready to learn. The situation was a little foggy because the new girl seemed strange to our Kim. Some time passed and our main character made a report at his work, when suddenly he noticed that something did not match in it. This report allocated 10 million more than necessary, but everything on the list matched, so he thought that Deputy Choi had embezzled this money. He was about to send a message to the manager, but decided to stop and give her the opportunity to admit it herself, because they worked with each other. Instead of sending the confession to the manager, he decided to invite her to dinner that evening to talk about it. She thought that he was just trying to get close to her so that she would become his girlfriend. This was completely wrong. He was texting Deputy Choi when suddenly he noticed something strange next to him. This strange one was a new girl who for some reason suddenly decided to make fun of him and try to get closer to him. He was very angry because of this joke, but she immediately noticed it and decided to invite him to dinner today, but she was immediately refused. He was very angry with her because of this behavior at work, so he began to scold her right at the workplace. At that moment, the new girl realized that Manager Kim did not remember her at all, despite the fact that they studied together at the same university. Some time passed and the working day ended, after which the deputy and manager went out to dinner together. The deputy still thought that Manager Kim was going to confess his love to her because he looked very serious, but she was not happy about it because the atmosphere was not the same. But they weren't the only ones in this restaurant, because a new girl who had just arrived today noticed how the two of them were leaving the company, so she accidentally followed them. She was so busy eavesdropping on the conversation that she didn't even notice how she was sitting at an empty table not ordering anything. The silence at the deputy's desk ended, and she decided to be the first to ask why Manager Kim called her there today. Manager Kim decided to start the conversation from the past to maintain a friendly atmosphere and started the conversation from their first day of work. 5 years have passed since they worked with each other, and Manager Kim was glad that despite all the quarrels, they stayed with each other. Deputy Choi did not understand at all how he dared to look at her and began to openly tell him off so that he would leave her. But at one moment, the smile disappeared from her face. That was the moment when he suddenly started talking about those 10 million that had disappeared from the account. At this point, Manager Kim became frank and started talking about what he came there for. He told her that at first he was going to confess to the manager, but decided to give her the opportunity to confess all this herself. There was an awkward silence at their table for a while, when suddenly Deputy Choi began to thank him and said that she would take full responsibility for this because it was her mistake. After that, they stayed in this restaurant and continued to have dinner, but after that, she could not get home alone, so the manager had to accompany her. Manager Kim walked her home, but they were not alone at that time because the new girl from their company was still following them. Manager Kim walked Deputy Choi straight to the bed so she could rest peacefully after such a hard evening. He was about to return to his home when suddenly the deputy asked him to pass her some water. He took the kitchen from the refrigerator and went to her to give her something to drink, but she was in such bad shape that she couldn't even drink water properly. At this moment, Manager Kim held back as best he could and tried not to do anything because he was in no position to take advantage of this situation. But at one point, the deputy, who constantly offended him, decided to confess to him that she was in love with him. She told him that all her bullying at work was only so that she could express her feelings for him because she didn't know how to do it otherwise. He was very surprised and didn't know what to do, but she continued to tell him about it and asked him to give her a chance. At that moment, his emotions got the better of him, and he could no longer hold back, so he stopped even trying and started playing. The fact that he started this attractive game made her understand that she was not indifferent to him either, because he instantly reacted to it. The game continued and they were not going to stop, when suddenly something very surprised the deputy. It was a steering wheel. She didn't expect at all that such a guy could have such a steering wheel that she just saw. Because of this, she began to lose her composure. Losing their composure, they only sped up the game and the race began to go much faster. Yerin at that moment began to tease Manager Kim and did not allow the car to enter the garage normally, disturbing him. She was going to tease him for a very long time, but suddenly his phone rang, which scared him very much, and he threw away the steering wheel of the console. The deputy was not going to let him go so easily and asked him to focus on her so that the race would be successful, but he didn't want that. He received a message on his phone from a new girl, asking him to come to a street that was close to them, so he stopped. For the deputy, it was a defeat, because she was going to beat him in this game in order to use it later, but Manager Kim simply left there because he thought it was wrong. But despite the fact that he managed to leave there, she managed to install a hidden camera when he went to get her a drink and took advantage of the fact that they were almost starting the race. So she decided to make incriminating evidence on him so that he would not tell anyone about how she stole 10 million. Manager Kim ran out of the entrance and was about to run to the address, but suddenly noticed someone right in the yard. There was a new girl sitting there who was driving him crazy with her actions. Manager Kim was worried about her, so he asked what happened to her that she suddenly called him to her place in the middle of the night. She didn't have anything serious, but she fell on that spot on purpose to call him to her. Of course he didn't know that. She decided to call him to the restaurant saying that he didn't go with her. That's why it happened. It was already the next working day and the entire working staff had gathered at one table, but something was wrong. A new girl who was sitting next to Manager Kim and learning from him noticed that Manager Kim was looking at Deputy Choi. She was about to get upset because she was starting to think that he liked Deputy Choi. Suddenly, in the middle of the workday, Manager Kim approached her and asked her to step aside because he had something to tell her. He approached her and decided to ask about yesterday because she promised to tell the manager about it, but he noticed that she was very confident. At that moment, Manager Kim shyly began to ask her about how everything went and whether she went at all. But at that moment, she suddenly turned him off and said that she couldn't talk now because she was working. Manager Kim was infuriated by this. So at one point, he decided to say that he would go and tell the manager everything if she didn't do this, but this did not frighten the deputy. He asked her to confess all this herself and accept responsibility, but she decided to mock him, so he left there. Going to the headmistress, he decided to immediately say that he wanted to confess something. The manager still didn't know about anything, so she became wary and asked if something had happened to him. But Manager Kim didn't want to talk about it in front of all his colleagues, so he asked her to go with him to the conference room. She agreed. They sat down at the negotiating table and he decided to start. Having told the manager that he noticed the disappearance of 10 million, he received a completely different reaction than he expected. Suddenly, the manager started talking about how he thanked his deputy for this. But at that moment, he still did not understand anything and began to ask her what she meant by this. Suddenly, his normal face changed to one of horror. It was a video of them almost starting their race last night. He became very angry and became emotional, which of course did not have a good effect on him. He claimed that it was a setup. Then at that moment, the manager asked her deputy to enter the negotiation room. When she entered the meeting room, the manager began asking her about what really happened. Despite the fact that she had already set him up in front of the manager, he still hoped that she would tell the truth and everything would end well. But suddenly tears appeared on the deputy's face, and she began to talk about how terrible Manager Kim was because he took advantage of her condition. Deputy Choi said in tears that her mother was deceived by scammers, so she took 10 million from the account and wanted to hide it. At this moment, Manager Kim was no longer himself, so he stood up and began to ask her to tell the truth. He couldn't understand why she was deceiving the leader and trying to set him up, but for us, everything was obvious. The manager was not going to tolerate this and gave him a final warning to stop behaving like that. His condition became much worse because the manager began to cover for the deputy and said that this amount should be marked as unforeseen expenses. It was just terrible because in fact he didn't do anything, but everyone was already accusing him and the manager was confident in her deputy's version. At that moment, all the moments that seemed illogical to him throughout his entire work in this company, in an instant became clear to him. He understood that if he endured it this time, then someday it would happen again, so he was going to repay them in the same coin that they gave him. Manager Kim understood that these women would never change because they told him that they could forgive Deputy Choi if she made a mistake. The manager began to worry about one moment because it began to seem to her that Manager Kim was slowly starting to retreat and stopped fighting. But Deputy Choi didn't think so because she thought he was just a very reserved character. The manager understood that if he went to complain to someone higher up, she would have a lot of headaches, so the deputy had to make sure that this did not happen. Manager Kim returned to his desk, but he was not himself and was very angry at that moment. This was noticed by a new girl who immediately realized that something bad had happened in the meeting room. After a while, the manager returned with her deputy and behaved completely normally as if nothing had happened. This began to anger our main character even more because he didn't understand how they could behave like that after what happened. Suddenly, he was distracted from these terrible thoughts. The new girl was worried about her friend and decided to ask him what was wrong with him. She just wanted to support him and told him that he could rely on her and trust her so that he would relax. But she addressed him informally, so this made Manager Kim even more angry and she had to apologize to him. They were talking to each other when suddenly the deputy decided to call the new girl over to do some work. The new girl didn't know where the warehouse she was sent to was located, so she asked Deputy Choi about it. But then she decided not to show it, but only responded with mockery at the expense of Manager Kim, which he immediately understood. He decided to ignore this act and calmly go show her the way to the warehouse where she would need to clean up. He needed to show the way to the warehouse as well as train her, so he started it right there. The new girl climbed onto a chair to reach the top shelf, but she slipped and began to fall. Manager Kim was nearby at that moment, so he managed to react quickly and catch her before she got hurt, and everything turned out okay. Despite the situation that happened, Manager Kim was calm and only told her not to damage anything anymore and to continue working there. He was about to leave there, when suddenly the new girl asked him to smile more often because she liked the smile. But that was not all she said. She mentioned that he looked much better before. This made him surprised. He decided to ask her if they had seen each other somewhere before, but did not expect to hear such an answer. Instead of telling him or answering normally, she just asked him to remember her. It was a little strange. He thought about her words as he left the warehouse and returned to his workplace. His working day quickly ended, so he went about his business. But closer to night, he was already standing under the house of Deputy Choi. She was very surprised and did not understand at all why he was waiting for her under her house. But he had absolutely no intention of standing on ceremony with her and immediately began asking her about what happened today. He considered himself abandoned. Deputy Choi wanted to justify herself to him, but he didn't let her say a word, so she shouted that he needed to find out everything from the supervisor. She turned around and was about to go home when suddenly something stopped her, namely his words about the audit. At this point, he was so angry that he decided to go to court so that she would receive punishment for misappropriating money from the business. As soon as she heard about this, she grabbed his hand and invited him to go to her home so that they could calmly discuss everything there. They went home and sat down on the sofa, where she was going to give him something to drink and eat so that he would calm down and they could talk calmly. But at that moment, he had no intention of doing anything like that and firmly decided that he had only come there to talk. He was not himself, so he was even ready to take on his name what they accused him of, just so that they would understand how crazy he could be. She was going to manipulate him again, but this time he did not fall into this trap and turned the situation in her favor. She was helpless at this moment and could not do anything, but she herself got into this situation, so now she will have to learn this lesson. Deputy Choi was very surprised by his determination and recklessness at that moment because he really started the race, which they stopped that time. But this time he was not going to stop and only continued to accelerate in this race, which did not give her peace because this way she would lose to him in the main race. This moment scared her very much because the car had changed and became much larger and faster than the last time when she first saw this car. She had already stopped resisting and began to assent to him during the race so that he would win this race as soon as possible. He had a sports car that couldn't be run on regular gasoline, so he needed to find a new type of fuel. She was delighted and at the same time scared of what would happen if he did start a real race and not a training one. This moment became a turning point for her because she caught herself in these crazy fantasies and no longer understood at all what was happening in real life. Because of this turning point, she decided to threaten him for a second, but she didn't succeed and this only made him angrier. It was the first time she had experienced such emotions from a race because they were simply magnificent. She had never had anything like this before and he realized this, so he teased her. She couldn't believe that such a loser as she considered him could drive a car so well and also make her experience the adrenaline of the race. Some time passed and she herself didn't even notice how her image left her face, and she began to tell him in real life how much she liked this race. Their drive had already lasted quite a long time, so the car needed to stop and refuel, but he couldn't do it right now because it would be dangerous. So he had to force her to arrange an emergency stop for the car so they could get out safely. Despite the fact that they got out of this car, he was not going to stop because the night would still be very long and he would need to correct many nuances. That's how the night went, that they played races all night. The next morning, he returned to work a little late. The manager pretended that she was worried about Manager Kim because he had to come to work early. Manager Kim began to make excuses to the manager and began to say that he overslept because he was doing exercises at night, thereby greatly embarrassing the deputy. He decided that today he would embarrass her all day, so all this time he continued to stare at the leader after they were chasing at night. Suddenly, when Manager Kim sat down at his workplace and thought that everything was fine, the deputy decided to take revenge on him and threw the folder with work on the table so that he could work. Usually it was very easy for her to shift her responsibilities to other employees, but today she had difficulty doing this because this employee was Manager Kim. Manager Kim was willing to help her, but that's not what she wanted from him. She was going to completely hand over her work plan to him. She was rude to him, but he wasn't going to put up with it, so he did something. After this action, she suddenly asked him to take over this job. The new girl did not understand at all what was happening next to her because the deputy made a fuss, although she simply asked him to take over the work. Manager Kim decided to answer her because he was unhappy with what she was doing. They started arguing with each other about this plan. The deputy could not stand it and decided to take away her work plan and continue working on it herself. But at that moment, he stopped his deputy and said that he would take on this work himself. Even though he was kind to her even after what she did, after he took her job, she continued to put even more work on him. Manager Kim did not refuse this job and said that he would do everything, and after that, Deputy Choi said that she would treat him for it after work. Deputy Choi began to rejoice, because it seemed to her that from now on she would be able to load him with work even more than she did before. As soon as she left them, the new girl was at a loss because her colleague had just agreed to all the demands of the deputy. Manager Choi was already returning to her workplace, but suddenly the manager called her to her place, so she immediately went to her. The manager was surprised that Manager Kim was so calm and obedient, so she decided to ask her what she did. Manager Choi replied that she simply followed the manager's order and made sure that he did not move from his place and calmly continued to work. Despite what happened last night after her defeat, Manager Choi was still confident that she could tame him and make him work. Suddenly, a message came on Manager Choi's phone that was from Manager Kim. He asked her to treat him today because she promised him this. She was glad of this because it seemed to her that he could not stand it any longer and thought that she was going the right way to make him work even more. She didn't mind it, so after work they went to a Chinese restaurant. Once at the restaurant, he was quite happy because she told him that he could order whatever his heart wanted. At that moment, he suddenly got up from his seat and sat next to her to talk about what happened at night because he wanted to repeat it again. It was already beginning to seem to her that he had gone crazy after the conflict that happened at their work, but this was only part of his plan. The restaurant was Chinese, so there were separate rooms, and they suddenly heard the voice of their work colleagues, namely the new girl and the manager. Despite the fact that their colleagues were in the next room next to them, Manager Kim had no intention of stopping during the current gaming session. On this day, she will have to try very hard so that no one can find out about how they play racing. She was very worried about the fact that someone might notice them playing, but he was not going to stop because of this. For Manager Kim, this was only a joy, because for him it would be much more interesting to play secretly, although the car was loud, but he had to hide it. The only one who was embarrassed by the start of the race in such a place was Manager Choi, but who cared? Right. No one. But this time he decided to tease her again that he could stop this race, and he did so, but began to accelerate on the spot. This irritated Manager Choi very much, but at the same time she really wanted to continue the race. The race started, but the car needed gas, so he immediately started telling Manager Choi about it, but she was against it. They paused the game when they heard the leader start a conversation. The manager started asking her about how close she was with Manager Kim, but having said that they were just studying in the same place, she learned that she should be careful because rumors could start going behind her back. The manager was surprised when she heard from her that she would not care about these rumors. When suddenly they heard the sounds of cars behind the wall, they were surprised. The leader was not very surprised because young people had been doing a lot of hooliganism lately and were constantly doing something similar in public places. The new girl at that moment thought she heard the voice of Manager Choi when suddenly she remembered that they were supposed to go to a restaurant today. Her guess was true, but she had no way of verifying it. At the same time, Manager Kim continued to punish Manager Choi for his misconduct. At that moment, one could immediately understand that it was not Manager Kim who fell into a trap, but quite the opposite. Some time passed and their game ended, after which they left this restaurant and were about to go home. Manager Kim was grateful to her for treating him to such a delicious and filling dinner right after work, so he decided to thank her. But Manager Choi was angry with him, so she was about to slap her, but he managed to grab her hand and leave it. She got really mad at him for grabbing her hands and for doing whatever he wanted, so she turned around and walked out of there. Some time passed and the new girl, late for work, was already running there at full speed. Upon entering the office, she was a little surprised because between Manager Kim and Manager Choi, a cold attitude could clearly be seen. But she really didn't understand why there was such a coldness between them, because she couldn't believe that they were the same people who did something like that recently in a restaurant. The new girl was approaching her workplace when suddenly Manager Kim was getting ready to go somewhere, so she ran after him to ask if he had lunch with anyone today. This question bothered him a little, but he replied that he had lunch today with a manager from the HR department. But the new girl didn't believe him and said that Manager Kim promised her not to lie and answer questions normally. He was very scared at that moment, so he simply decided to avoid this conversation and leave there, using the excuse that he needed to go give a report. Suddenly, a real manager from the HR department was next to them during this conversation, who was surprised by his answer, because she has lunch alone every day. The manager at that moment was heading to her workplace when suddenly a call rang on her phone. It was the manager who called her to his place after lunch. She was not very happy about this call, but she had to immediately go to the company manager's office. The manager was a disgusting man who invited her there to play a racing game with him, but she didn't want it. She decided to tease him with the fact that she would stand at the very start, not letting him drive the car himself in order to ask him for a favor at that moment. She succeeded because the manager got angry and asked her what she wanted from him. At that moment, she answered him. She did all this so that at the next quarterly meeting, the manager promoted her to manager and also recommended her as head of the department. She continued to tease him at this moment and manipulated him so that he would quickly agree to her proposal, which, of course, he did at that moment. Right after he agreed to promote her, it was time for his reward. She was going to warm up during the game, but he very quickly started the race itself, which the leader did not like at all. She did not feel happy from this game. During such games with the company manager, she did not feel happy and only continued to play in order to improve her position in the company. Manager Kim went to see the HR manager he supposedly had dinner with, but he didn't even know what she looked like. Therefore, their meeting was a little awkward due to the fact that he did not recognize her, although he went to her office. She wasn't there at first, but she came back after him. They had just met each other and were pleased to meet in person, because previously they only communicated through messages and mail. The manager was shy around him, which really bothered Manager Kim. He went to her not in order to meet her in person, but in order to personally convey to her the report that he was drawing up for her. After the transfer, they talked a little, and he decided to leave there. But before that, they agreed to have dinner together to chat with each other and get to know each other better, because they worked in the same company. Before leaving, she finally decided to admit that she heard a conversation in the corridor when the new girl asked him not to lie to her, so she told him to now have dinner with her. He was a little embarrassed because he realized that she had heard their entire conversation.